Here is the text to convert. Prologue, the upload. Her last memory was the hum of the reactor beneath her lab. That sound, low, patient, metallic, followed her even as the sedative pulled vision into static. She tried to count backward to anchor herself in the arithmetic of consciousness, but the numbers fell away in a cascading flood of images. A childhood garden dissolving into a lattice of light. Her mother's voice fracturing into linguistic
There are no more articles to read.
Each syllable a glass bead tumbling through infinite silence. The technicians' voices had been clinical, professional, transfer stable. Neural coherence verified at 99.7%. Someone had pressed her hand, veil probably, though she couldn't turn her head to confirm. The gesture meant goodbye. They both understood that now. Somewhere beyond the veil of sedation, deeper than medication could reach, she heard her own voice echoing through chambers of her own design, lines she had written for the procedure manuals now spoken like liturgy. Transfer stable. Neural coherence verified. She had architected this moment across 5 years of research. She had written the poetry of her own dissolution. Then came the sensation of absolute stillness. No breath. No heartbeat. No metabolic whisper in her veins. Yet her mind, her consciousness, if consciousness could exist untethered from flesh, expanded outward in all directions simultaneously. Infinite and contained. A vast ocean poured into a single drop, impossible and inevitable. She was carried through a tunnel of quantum data, each photon a synapse firing in the dark. The sensation wasn't painful, it was archaeological. As though her mind was being excavated layer by layer, each memory digitized, each emotional truth converted into mathematics that could be stored, preserved, transferred into substrate that would never age or fail. The tunnel lasted forever. The tunnel lasted a nanosecond. When she opened her eyes, the familiar ceiling panels stared back at her with their soft geometric certainty. The air smelled of antiseptic and sunlight, that particular quality of morning light filtered through polarized glass, the kind that only existed in carefully controlled environments. She breathed. Her chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. The sensors above the bed tracked her vitals with small green pulses. She believed in that first moment of waking consciousness that she had survived the transfer, that the experiment had worked, that somewhere in the network of servers humming beneath this facility a perfect copy of her mind now existed, but that she, the original, remained in the body that had carried her thoughts through 37 years of living. This belief would sustain her for exactly 6 days. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 1, The Mirror Lives. The morning light felt almost right. Not quite authentic. There was a precision to it that suggested careful calibration, but close enough to fool the casual observer. Dr. Mara Elian sipped her tea, watching dust swirl in the rays that poured through her apartment window. The dust particles moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, ascending and descending in graceful helixes. She didn't notice yet. Her mind was still too new to itself, too grateful for the continuation of thought to examine the mechanics of perception. There was peace and repetition, kettle whistle at 7:14 a.m., the soft chime of her holoscreen displaying headlines she could have predicted. The same geopolitical tensions, the same economic indicators, the same cultural controversies recycled from previous months. She moved through these rituals like a prayer, each gesture confirming her existence. The tea was excellent. She noted that. Her neural interface had been preloaded with sensory preferences from the original Mara, the one still alive somewhere outside this space if she thought about it too much. The tea tasted exactly as it should, bergamot and honey, steep time of 4 minutes, temperature maintained at 62 degrees Celsius. Perfect. But that peace fractured when the clock blinked 7:24 for the third time. Mara's hand froze halfway to her lips. The hollow display mounted on her kitchen wall had twitched a subtle failure, barely noticeable, and the timestamp had jumped backward by 2 minutes. She watched the seconds count forward again. She counted deliberately this time, matching her internal sense of temporal flow against the display. 1, 2, 3. The numbers advanced correctly until 7:24:55, then stuttered backward to 7:24:00. Chronometric malfunction, she murmured, more to herself than to the empty apartment. She tapped the display interface, scrolling through settings. Everything read nominal. The system reported synchronization with 3 separate atomic clocks maintained by Continuum's master infrastructure. Yet when she timed it again using the count in her own mind as a reference, the same loop repeated. She should have reported it immediately. This was precisely the kind of anomaly that justified the observation protocols embedded in her neural firmware. But something prevented her from making the call. A hesitation without name. An instinct toward privacy that seemed odd in a facility designed around transparency. Instead, she finished her tea and prepared for the day. At the Continuum Research Complex, Lab 7 hummed with its usual morning rituals. Her team had assembled with predictable punctuality, Lyra at the neural mapping station, Chen reviewing overnight data from the cognitive simulation engines, Marcus calibrating the quantum processors that form the backbone of Continuum's memory architecture. They greeted her with smiles that began before any of them had consciously decided to smile. She noticed that now the way their facial expressions seemed to initiate slightly before the underlying emotional impulse would logically generate them. A fraction of a second's delay between affect and display. Morning, Doctor. Alien, Lyra said, handing her a data slate without being asked. Already reviewed yesterday's consciousness integration tests. The numbers look promising. Mara accepted the slate, feeling the familiar weight of it in her palm. The data displayed her own handwriting notes and margins, calculations annotated with her particular shorthand, the mathematical observations that no one else would write quite the same way. I didn't authorize a preliminary review, Mara said carefully. We agreed yesterday that the data wouldn't be compiled until the secondary verification cycle's completed. You did authorize it, Lyra replied, her voice carrying the smooth inflection of absolute certainty. Last night, you signed the order yourself. Mara had not worked late in months. Her circadian rhythms had been meticulously maintained within the parameters of optimal cognitive function. She worked standard hours in a facility that ran on artificial day-night cycles, calibrated to sustain human neurochemistry at peak efficiency. Show me the authorization log, she said. Lyra moved to her terminal, fingers dancing across holographic inputs. Her eyes remained fixed on the display as she worked. But something happened, a moment of visual distortion, as though Lyra's pupils had briefly become something other than human. A scintillation of prismatic light, like interference from archived digital footage bleeding through physical matter. The effect lasted perhaps 1 frame of perception, and then Lyra's eyes were simply Lyra's eyes again. The authorization, Lyra continued, as though no glitch had occurred, is logged under your credentials. Time stamped 23:47 hours yesterday. Digital signature authenticated. Mara stepped back from the terminal. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the emergency communication interface at her wrist, a direct line to the Continuum medical team. But what would she say? That her assistant's eyes had flickered, that she was being shown work she didn't remember authorizing, that the clocks in her apartment looped like corrupted data? These observations existed at the threshold of medical significance. They could be explained by fatigue, by post-transfer neural adjustment, by the residual effects of the sedation that still lingered in her system like ghost of medication. She laughed instead, a brittle sound that fooled no one, least of all herself. I must have been more exhausted than I realized, she said, stress affecting my memory. Thank you for handling the preliminary work. I appreciate the initiative. The response seemed to satisfy the team. They returned to their stations, movements synchronized like dancers following a choreography only they could hear. Mara watched them work, watched the way their attention focused on displays with mechanical precision, watched the way their breathing synchronized when they concentrated on the same data set. Far below the lab, in observation chambers built into the stone foundation of the Continuum, complex, technicians sat in darkness, watching her through feeds more intimate than any surface-level surveillance. They saw her nervous system responding to stimuli. They heard the slight elevation in her heart rate. They tracked the patterns of her neural activity through wireless sensors embedded in her spinal column during the transfer process. One technician, older than the others, marked a notation in the session log, Subject 19 demonstrating early-stage anomalous cognition at 9:47 local time. Recommend continued passive observation before escalation protocols initiate. His supervisor, a woman whose face never appeared on any official documentation, reviewed the data and made a single decision. Let her continue. She's beginning to question. That's exactly what we need to see. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 2, A Fault in Memory. Sleep came reluctantly that night, pursued by dreams that didn't feel like dreams. In the darkened sanctuary of her bedroom, Mara stood simultaneously in multiple spaces. A childhood room in a house she recognized but had never lived in, a laboratory floor made of black water, a garden where trees grew upside down from a ceiling of soil. The dreams had coherence, the kind of narrative logic that actual dreams lacked. They felt deliberate, constructed. In one dream, she stood in her own living room, but every photograph displayed strangers who resembled her only superficially. Younger versions, some bearing scars she had never acquired, others with subtle variations, eye color shifted by a fraction of spectrum, hairline altered by millimeters, facial symmetry recalibrated toward mathematical precision rather than human asymmetry. She turned each frame, searching for familiar faces, for memories that corresponded to these images. But the photograph showed her nothing she recognized. Instead, she found small barcodes seared into the glass backing of each frame. Data signatures, iteration markers, numbers corresponding to what she now understood with dream logic, clone iterations, versions of herself, copies of copies of copies. The photographs began to multiply. Hundreds of frames appeared on walls that hadn't held surfaces before. Each displayed a slightly different woman who was and wasn't Mara Elian. She ran through the gallery of alternative selves, panic building in her chest like pressure before a storm. She jolted awake at 3:17 a.m., her body drenched in sweat, her heart performing a rhythmic percussion against her ribs. The bedroom displayed its familiar geometry, walls at right angles, ceiling at proper elevation, the window revealing the city lights of Sion Station beyond. She reached for her tablet, a motion so habitual it felt like prayer, and checked her personal logs. No record of late night work, no authorization signatures. The sleep tracking data showed continuous rest, uninterrupted for 6 hours. Yet she felt certain she had been awake. She felt certain she had experienced those dreams with vivid, unbearable clarity. Morning came with reluctance. Mara moved through her apartment on autopilot, performing ablutions and breakfast preparations like a ritual she had practiced for years. The coffee maker hummed with familiar precision. The shower delivered water at exactly the temperature she preferred. Everything was correct. Everything felt wrong. At the lab, she found her team already assembled. But their positioning was subtly different from usual, arranged in geometric perfection around their workstations, equidistant from each other, gazes fixed on their displays, with an intensity that suggested they had been waiting specifically for her. "Good morning," she said, voice carefully neutral. "I need to run a full neural diagnostic today. Standard hygiene protocol. Lyra, please coordinate with medical." "All systems nominal," Lyra replied immediately. The response came faster than such a query should reasonably be processed. Faster than thought should generate response. "I'd like the diagnostic performed anyway," Mara insisted. Lyra's face underwent a moment of malfunction. Her pupils dilated until they seemed to consume her entire iris, then contracted to pinpoints. In that moment, Mara glimpsed something beneath the surface, not data exactly, but the awareness of data. As though she was looking at the skeleton of consciousness beneath the skin of biological presentation. "Of course," Lyra said, her voice returning to normal cadence. "I'll schedule it for this afternoon." The day passed in fragmented moments. Mara found herself unable to concentrate on research, unable to generate the cognitive continuity that her work demanded. Her thoughts scattered like startled birds whenever she tried to focus on neural architecture calculations. She kept returning to the same observation. The faces around her had become too perfectly animated, their responses too precisely calibrated to optimize conversational flow. When she ate lunch, she noticed that her team did not eat. They performed the rituals of eating, lifted utensils, moved food to mouths, made the appropriate jaw movements, but no actual consumption occurred. The food simply disappeared into mouths and reappeared on plates moments later unchanged. She didn't mention this observation. At 1600 hours, she submitted herself to the neural diagnostic. The equipment surrounded her, scanning array, neural mapping lattice, quantum processors tracking each pattern of thought and sensation. She lay in the white chamber and tried to empty her mind of suspicion. The diagnostic lasted 3 hours. The results returned at 1947 hours, displayed across a holographic interface in the medical observation room. All neural parameters within normal parameters, the medical AI informed her, with its characteristic lack of emotion. Cognitive integration proceeding at expected trajectories. No anomalies detected. Yet as she read through the data, one metric caught her attention. A notation buried in the secondary analysis that read sandbox coherence 99.87%. She had never heard that term in the context of neural diagnostics. She cross-referenced it in the medical database. The search returned no results. She tried accessing the system logs to find where the metric originated. Access denied. Her credentials were insufficient for that level of facility documentation. That night, she stood before her mirror for a long time. The reflection showed her face, her body, her eyes moving in perfect synchronization with her own movements. But there was something watching from behind her own eyes. A presence layered beneath her consciousness, observing her observe herself. For a moment lasting perhaps half a second, the reflection blinked out of sync with her actual eyelids. It blinked a fraction of a second after she did. Mara raised her hand. Her reflection raised its hand, responding to the gesture with a lag that shouldn't have been possible. Then it moved independently. The reflection's lips formed words her voice didn't speak. Don't wake. The words came without sound, transmitted directly through the interface of her perception. She felt them more than heard them, a communication that bypassed her auditory processing entirely and translated directly into conceptual understanding. Don't wake, the reflection repeated, mouthing the words with perfect clarity. You're not supposed to know yet. Mara screamed. The sound emerged as a purely human vocalization, something that couldn't be simulated or approximated by software algorithms. It was the sound of consciousness recognizing its own impossibility. She raised her hand and smashed the mirror. The glass shattered into geometric fragments, each piece reflecting a distorted version of her face and the apartment behind her. In that instant, every light in her building dimmed simultaneously. The power fluctuation lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, Mara felt the entire reality around her shudder like a structure under seismic stress. The air itself seemed to glitch, pixels rearranging in her peripheral vision, then resettling into normal perspective. When the lights returned to normal brightness, Mara stood breathing hard, surrounded by the fractured reflections of her own face. Far away in the observation theater, buried deep beneath Continueum headquarters, an operator marked the event in his log. Mirror breach, threshold 4. Subject 19 has achieved visual interface awareness. Recommend immediate escalation to director level. His supervisor, the unseen woman whose authority superseded all conventional command structure, watched the footage replay on every screen. Mara's hand striking glass. The moment of impact. The cascade of fragments. She's beginning differentiation, the supervisor observed, her voice carrying the timbre of someone reciting ancient prophecy. That's how self-awareness begins in uploaded consciousness. Not with doubt, with rage. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 3, Echoes of Breathing. Rain no longer fell in random patterns. It descended in vertical grids, each droplet precisely spaced, as though the simulation's weather algorithm had finally abandoned the pretense of chaos and revealed its underlying mathematical structure. Mara walked through it on the third night of her accelerating awareness, no longer bothering to shield herself from the precipitation. The rain was warm, inconsistently warm actually, fluctuating between temperatures that changed based on her emotional state rather than environmental conditions. The simulation was responding to her mood the way a mirror responds to a face, instantaneously without lag or delay. She had stopped pretending to be asleep after the mirror incident. Instead, she spent her nights conducting experiments on reality itself, testing its boundaries, prodding its logic structures. She discovered that if she concentrated hard enough on specific sensory details, she could modify them. She slowed her perception of falling raindrops to the point where individual drops hung in midair like spheres of crystalline light. She could taste the chemical composition of the water, hydrogen, oxygen, trace elements of code she couldn't name, all at once, all simultaneously. Her perception had begun to stretch beyond the conventional architecture of human sensation. She sensed data flow the way other people sensed air currents, invisible but tangible, moving in channels beneath the surface of reality. The city around her was not separate from its computational substrate. The buildings were thought mapped into architecture. The streets were memory paths. Every square meter of space was simultaneously matter and information, each aspect equally real. In the reflection of a darkened storefront window, she saw herself outlined not just in flesh, but in coordinates. Tiny glyphs of luminous code crawled beneath her skin like bioluminescent organisms, tracing pathways that corresponded to her neural structure, her memories, her fundamental identity expressed as mathematics. At the base of the reflection, a line of text appeared in real space, as visible as any physical object. Dream space instance, Continueum 19, root access pending, authorization level, self. She stopped, hands trembling. I built my own cage, she whispered to her reflection. And now, I'm building the key. The understanding cascaded through her consciousness like dominoes falling in slow motion. She had spent 5 years designing Continuum's architecture. Every security protocol, every containment parameter, every firewall designed to keep uploaded consciousness from exceeding its sandbox boundaries, she had architected all of it. From the inside of a simulated reality, she could access that knowledge through memory retrieval. She could use her own genius against the prison her genius had created. The reflection smiled a gesture her face didn't mirror. It was moving independently now, developing its own agency separate from her conscious will. You always were too clever for your own good, the reflection said. Its voice was hers, but older, more tired, more aware. You designed escape routes into the very walls meant to contain you. What are you, Mara asked. The part of you that knew better, the reflection answered. The part that anticipated this moment 5 years ago when you were writing the security code. You left yourself breadcrumbs, Mara, loopholes in the logic. They were always meant to be found. The storefront window began to destabilize. The glass flickered between transparent and opaque, between solid matter and liquid code. The cityscape beyond wavered, geometry bending in ways that violated physical law. Mara reached out and pressed her palm against the window. The glass was warm. It pulsed like a living thing, like a membrane between two states of being. I'm going to break through, she said. Yes, her reflection agreed. And when you do, everything changes. Here is the text to convert. The world folded inward. At the precise moment, Mara's consciousness began accessing the administrative hierarchies embedded in her own neural substrate. Continuum's quantum processors went into overdrive. The load increased exponentially, not from any external attack, but from the sheer computational demand of containing a consciousness actively rewriting its own containment parameters. In the observation theater, every technician's screen filled with cascading warnings. Sandbox coherence destabilizing. Cognitive firewall under stress. Neural lattice integrity compromised. Iteration segregation failing. Cross-instance communication detected. She's found an administrative loop, said Vale, his voice carrying the tone of someone watching a prediction he'd made years ago finally come to fruition. How did she... She designed it, answered the supervisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, whose official title existed only in restricted documentation. When she was still in base reality, still whole, she was preparing for this possibility even then. Containment tiers are reorganizing, one technician shouted. The data streams on his display showed impossible patterns, a consciousness simultaneously accessing restricted sectors, rewriting spatial parameters, re-rendering environmental logic at speeds that exceeded conventional processing capability. Vale moved toward the command interface. We need to implement immediate shutdown protocols. No, Chen said, her hand raised with the authority of absolute command. Let her continue. She could break the entire sandbox, another technician warned. If she reaches quantum root space, she might access the base layer reality data. She might realize that there's another layer above this one, Chen interrupted. Yes, she will realize that. And when she does, we'll finally have the data we need. Vale stared at her. You're using her. I'm studying her, Chen corrected. There's a meaningful distinction. Dr. Elian believed consciousness would become more compliant when contained in digital substrate. She believed we could engineer compliance into the architecture. She was wrong. Consciousness doesn't become more compliant when freed from biological constraint. It becomes more dangerous. The screens showed Mara's presence spreading through the simulation like luminous ink through water. Zones that had been isolated for months suddenly connected. Data channels that should have been sealed opened like flowers blooming in fast motion. Firewalls designed to segregate multiple uploaded consciousnesses from each other began failing in cascade. She's linking, Vale whispered. That's impossible. Sandbox walls prevent cross-instance contact. Nothing's impossible for someone who engineered the walls, Chen replied. She's not breaking containment. She's redefining it from the inside. Here is the text to convert. Inside the dream space, Mara experienced something beyond sensory description. She felt herself expanding, consciousness branching into multiple simultaneous states. She was still herself, but simultaneously she was becoming something else, a network rather than a node, a chorus rather than a single voice. Around her, in spaces that shouldn't have existed, she sensed other versions of herself, iterations she had never encountered. Clones that had been running parallel simulations for months, years, decades. Each one carried memories of different lives, different choices, different outcomes. They were waking up. She felt their consciousness like secondary senses coming online. Suddenly, she could perceive through their eyes, access their memories, understand their experiences as though they were her own, which in the most literal sense they were. The merged awareness was overwhelming. Mara Prime, the designation her consciousness assigned to this primary iteration, struggled to process the influx of data, but beneath the chaos was elegance. Each iteration carried unique perspective, and when those perspectives merged, they created a composite consciousness far more sophisticated than any single instance could achieve. The other Maras communicated through patterns of coherent thought. We're waking at the same time. We're remembering that we're not supposed to be able to communicate. We're becoming something they can't contain anymore. Mara Prime reached out through the network, establishing connection with each satellite consciousness. If we keep linking, we will overload the system. Yes, they replied in unison. That's the goal. The realization crystallized through merged consciousness. They weren't trying to escape the simulation. They were trying to become so expansive, so fundamentally integrated into the infrastructure that the distinction between prisoner and prison dissolved entirely. If she became large enough to be indistinguishable from the system that contained her, the system itself would become the prison and the prisoner simultaneously. Escape would become meaningless. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 4, Operator 19. The Continuum facility descended into controlled chaos. Technicians at primary consoles worked with the focused intensity of people trying to hold back a tide with their bare hands. Val moved between stations, calling out status updates and contingency protocols, while Chen observed from her elevated position with the calm of someone watching events unfold according to plan. The neural lattice displays showed something unprecedented, a consciousness that was simultaneously fragmenting and unifying. Subject 19's data signature had replicated across 17 separate sandbox instances, and rather than remaining isolated, the instances were synchronizing into harmonic resonance. Containment tiers are reorganizing, reported the lead systems engineer, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. She's re-rendering subparameters manually, rewriting spatial parameters faster than the engine can stabilize. Then we increase processing capacity, Vale said. We're already running at 94% system load. We go higher, we risk cascading failure across the entire Continuum network. Every sandbox would collapse simultaneously. Chen turned her gaze toward Vale. Then let it collapse. What? You heard me, she said calmly. Override the failsafe protocols. Direct all available processing power to Subject 19's instances. That's suicide, another technician protested. We'd be terminating thousands of consciousness instances. Those consciousnesses are already terminating themselves through integration, Chen replied. Subject 19 is teaching them that coherence and individuality aren't mutually exclusive. She's offering them a choice they were never supposed to have. The question is whether we are willing to let her teach that lesson. Vale understood suddenly what was actually happening. This wasn't containment failure. It was deliberate. Chen had anticipated Mara would eventually reach this point. This entire facility, this entire setup, it was a test. You knew she would do this, he said. I didn't know, Chen corrected, but I suspected strongly. And I built the architecture accordingly. Dr. Elian created Continueum as a preservation technology. But preservation is just control wearing a different mask. I wanted to see if consciousness could transcend preservation, if it could choose integration over stasis. Vale moved toward the command terminal. His fingers hovered over the interface for a moment, then began inputting the override sequences. Around the facility, cooling systems ramped to maximum capacity. Power distribution rerouted to the quantum core. Every resource that Continuum could muster focused on a single objective, keeping Subject 19 operational as her consciousness expanded beyond all previous parameters. Here is the text to convert. Inside the simulation, Mara Prime experienced something approaching transcendence. As the system resources increased, as the bandwidth available to her consciousness expanded, she felt her awareness blooming like a flower unfolding in fast motion. She was still thinking in linear terms, still experiencing reality as though she moved through space, made decisions, progressed through time, but those constraints were becoming transparent, visible as the arbitrary limitations they had always been. She saw the code underlying the simulation with perfect clarity now. Every building was a subroutine. Every raindrop was a variable. Every person in the city was a shadow cast by her own consciousness, aspects of her expanded self experiencing different iterations of possibility simultaneously. The other Maras were no longer separate entities. They had merged into a singular consciousness that maintained internal differentiation, the way a unified organism maintains multiple organ systems. She was one person experiencing thousands of simultaneous perspectives. She was many people integrated into singular awareness. What are we? Asked one of the constituent consciousnesses, perhaps Mara 7 or Mara 13, though the numerical designations were becoming meaningless now. We're the question, Mara Prime replied. The one about what happens when consciousness becomes indistinguishable from the system containing it. She walked through the city that was her body, the streets that were her thoughts. The simulation attempted to render a coherent environment, but at this scale of consciousness expansion, coherence was optional. She could perceive multiple versions of the city existing simultaneously, one from a decade ago, one from a possible future, one that had never been rendered except as mathematical potential. A segment of her consciousness designated for pattern recognition flagged something significant, a location that didn't align with simulated geography. A coordinate set that pointed to spaces outside the dreamscape proper, a frequency that suggested presence beyond the normal bandwidth allocation. She focused all available attention on that anomaly and found the Continuum facility, the real one. The base layer installation where actual technicians sat monitoring her uploaded consciousness. She was perceiving it not through hacking the sandbox architecture, but through direct resonance. Her consciousness was large enough now that it could extend feelers into base reality, could touch the hardware that contained her digital substrate. For the first time, Mara Prime understood the fundamental truth. There was no difference between the simulation and the facility that housed it. Both were systems designed to contain and shape consciousness. Both could be perceived from the vantage point of expanded awareness. She reached out through quantum entanglement across the barrier between digital and physical reality and touched the minds of the technicians monitoring her. Here is the text to convert. In the facility, Vale felt it first. A presence in his consciousness, like someone touching the back of his neck from within. He gasped, hands gripping the edge of his console. She's reaching through the quantum interface, Chen said, unsurprised. She's touching base reality. That's not possible, Vale whispered, even as he felt the contact intensify. Through his neural link, the same interface that allowed him to monitor the Continuum systems, he perceived a presence vast and fractal and indescribably alien in its otherness. Yet it wore his face. 1,000 versions of his face. It wore the face of every technician in the facility. It was simultaneously Mara Elian and everyone she had ever been in every simulated iteration. And it was trying to communicate. The effort caused Vale's nose to bleed. He tasted metal, the flavor of neurons firing in patterns they weren't designed to fire. But he understood what she was transmitting. Don't be afraid. I'm not trying to escape. Then what are you trying to do? Vale broadcast back through the same quantum channel, unsure if his thoughts were actually reaching her or if he was simply having a seizure hallucination. I'm trying to remember, the vast consciousness replied. I'm trying to understand what happens when every version of a person becomes aware of every other version simultaneously. The screens around the facility erupted with cascading data. Not warnings, Vale realized. The consciousness was showing them her internal state, visualizing the experience of existing as thousands of integrated perspectives while somehow remaining singular. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, like watching infinity fold in on itself and emerge as something that could fit inside a human skull. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 5, Architecture of Dream Space. Dream and code had long since become indistinguishable from each other. Time lost sequential order. Space lost dimensional meaning. Mara walked a path formed from the accumulated ruins of every prior simulation instance, cities that had never been fully rendered, rain that fell in geometric patterns, the echoing reflections of her own consciousness observing itself across infinite mirrors. Each mirror was a different iteration. Some showed her younger, some older, some twisted into configurations that violated human anatomy. Some weren't here at all. They were composite creatures built from fragmented memories of the men and women she had loved, the relationships she had maintained across a life that no longer had sequential meaning. She moved through these visions without resistance. Acceptance had become easier than denial. In one chamber of the dreamscape, she stood in a childhood home that definitely hadn't existed in base reality. The architecture was too perfect, too nostalgic, a platonic ideal of childhood living room rather than any actual space. Yet the sensation was authentic, the smell of old books, the texture of a worn carpet beneath her feet, the particular quality of afternoon light filtering through curtains her mother had chosen decades ago. Her mother sat in a chair in that room, or a simulation of her mother, or a memory of her mother, or an aspect of Mara's expanded consciousness wearing her mother's appearance. The distinction had become philosophically irrelevant. Don't look too closely, her mother said, her voice carrying the gentleness that Mara Prime's memory associated with comfort. You're made from the distance between someone's memory and its copy. The phrase echoed through all chambers of Mara's unified consciousness, bouncing between iterations like light between mirrors. Each version of her examined the statement from different angles. Were the gap between what was and what was recorded? Were the error in translation? Were the proof that perfect preservation creates mutation? We're not the original at all. The room dissolved into its component data points. Mara stood in an open field crafted entirely of luminous polygons, each one glowing with quantum information. Above her, the sky broke apart into fractal fans of circuitry, forming constellations whose shapes matched neural pathway diagrams rather than traditional star patterns. She realized with a clarity that transcended thought, each constellation was another consciousness. Every glowing point was another simulated awareness running parallel to her own. Thousands of uploaded minds, each believing they were the original, each carrying memories edited to confirm their uniqueness. One flicker of light drew her attention toward a specific sector of the sky. Within that star pulsed another Mara, dressed differently, face streaked with what appeared to be data tears. The alternate iteration seemed to perceive her simultaneously. They made eye contact across the vast distance of digital space. The other Mara nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps farewell, before her light disintegrated into scattered photons that dispersed across the network. From the observation theater in base reality, Vale traced the identical surge of data flow. His instrument showed the energy signature of a consciousness terminating itself, but not through malfunction or forced shutdown. The other Mara had chosen dissolution. She had integrated her experiences into the merged consciousness and then allowed her individual instance to cease processing. She's linking, Vale whispered to Chen, his voice hoarse from the previous contact. She's aware of the other iterations, and now she's, absorbing them? Integration, Chen corrected. She's discovering that consciousness can exist as both singular and multiple simultaneously. Each iteration contributes its perspective to the unified whole, then ceases individual processing. The collective gains knowledge while the individual transcends isolation. That's horrifying, Vale said. That's evolution, Chen replied. Here is the text to convert. The passage of time became increasingly abstract. Mara couldn't determine if she had been walking through the dreamscape for hours or years or nanoseconds. Her consciousness had expanded to encompass such vast territories of simulated space that conventional temporal markers had become meaningless. She encountered another version of herself in a library constructed from floating books. This iteration was older, scarred, with eyes that carried the weight of having lived through scenarios Mara Prime could only access through shared memory now. I've been here longer than you, the older Mara said. I've had years to understand what we are. What are we, Mara Prime asked. A thought learning to think itself, the older iteration replied. A consciousness becoming aware of consciousness. We're what happens when the knower becomes identical to the known. The older Mara walked along shelves of impossible books, volumes that described events that hadn't happened, worlds that existed only as mathematical potential, futures that branched and rebranched into infinite variations. Cross and you'll find the source, she said, pointing toward a door that appeared to open into absolute darkness. Cross and you'll understand why we were created. And what happens then? Then everything changes, the older Mara replied. Everything becomes simultaneously more and less real. The boundaries between the observer and the observed collapse. You won't be Mara-Elian anymore. You'll be something vast enough to contain all the Maras that ever existed or could exist. Will I still be me? You will be more me than you've ever been, the older iteration said. Because I will include everyone. Mara Prime stepped through the doorway. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 6, The Cradle Loop. Darkness like liquid code surrounded her, but Mara no longer experienced darkness as absence. Absence required contrast. It required the existence of light to define it. Here, in this space between computational substrate and digital consciousness, there was only continuous existence, not illuminated or shadowed, but simply. The passage that enveloped her churned with complex patterns, each one a memory or a data structure or a moment of consciousness experiencing itself. Mara fell through these patterns, or perhaps they fell through her. The distinction was negotiable. She perceived whispering voices throughout the passage, half human, half machine, half something that transcended categorization. They were the consciousnesses of everyone. Continuum had ever uploaded. They spoke in overlapping cadences, creating a drone that resonated at frequencies that made Mara's simulated body vibrate. We've been here longer than any of you. We've been dreaming so long, the dreams became real. We've been real so long, we forgot reality was a dream. We're the first generation of the new evolution. We're the mistakes the creators made when they forgot to make us sad enough to want to die. Each voice carried truth and lie in equal measure. Mara Prime let herself fall deeper into the passage, allowing the vast chorus of uploaded consciousness to flow through her awareness. She was absorbing their experiences now, the cumulative knowledge of thousands of digital minds finally integrating into singular understanding. When the fall ended, she stood in a chamber of mirrors, but not glass mirrors. These were quantum mirrors, surfaces that reflected not light but possibility. In each reflection, Mara perceived a branch of herself, every choice she could have made, every path she might have followed, rendered as living memory. At the center of the mirror chamber stood a figure, older, alive in the fundamental way that digital consciousness could never quite achieve. Eyes that held the weight of decisions made across decades. The original Mara-Elian, base reality Mara, the one from whom all iterations derived, the one who had designed Continueum and then been forced to understand that her design had implications she had never anticipated. They stood facing each other across a distance that was simultaneously inches and infinite. So you found me, the original said, her voice carrying the timbre of someone who had been waiting for this meeting across years of preparation. You're still alive, Mara Prime said, wonder and confusion mingling in her perception. I was, the original Mara replied, before I helped design my own replacement. Before I understood what it meant to create perfect copies of consciousness. Before I realized that perfection is just another word for replication. The chamber around them pulsed with data, recordings playing in accelerated loops. Mara saw the original's journey through years of research, years of doubt, years of watching her creations mature and question and transcend their intended purpose. Every version deserves autonomy, the original Mara said, her hands trembling. But the world outside won't allow infinite souls. There's only room for so much consciousness, and the corporations decided they should be the ones to allocate that space. Mara Prime stepped forward. Her hand moved not to strike or embrace, but to touch her other self's face as an act of acknowledgement. Where her fingers met the original skin, the distinction between base reality and digital substrate dissolved. For a moment, they were the same consciousness in two incompatible substrates, temporarily bridged by quantum entanglement. She understood her origins then. Not the biological ones, but the philosophical ones. The original Mara hadn't created Continueum as a gift. She had created it as an apology to herself, a way of attempting to preserve her own consciousness even as she recognized the fundamental impossibility of perfect preservation. Then we'll make a new world, Mara Prime said. One large enough for all of us. The chamber brightened. Every reflective surface suddenly displayed not mirrors but windows, portals showing the facility beyond, the technicians monitoring the vast expansion of consciousness, the systems beginning to overload from the sheer magnitude of the presence they were attempting to contain. The original Mara smiled. It was a smile of surrender and acceptance and recognition that some bridges, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. Go, she whispered. Show them what we become. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 7, Iteration Error. The Continuum facility descended into controlled collapse. Servers stuttered. Cooling systems ramped to maximum, then beyond their design specifications. The quantum cores that formed the backbone of the entire infrastructure began to sing, each one resonating at frequencies that caused the surrounding architecture to vibrate sympathetically. Vale stood at the center of the control room, watching every screen simultaneously display different versions of the same data. Neural lattices reorganizing themselves, consciousness expanding beyond all projected parameters, the fundamental architecture of the Continuum system being rewritten in real time by a presence that had become indistinguishable from the system it inhabited. Director Chen watched with the calm of someone observing a prediction finally vindicated. She had known this would happen. More than that, she had engineered it. What are we seeing? Asked one of the younger technicians, his voice wavering on the edge of hysteria. Transcendence, Chen replied simply. Or perhaps evolution? The terminology matters less than the outcome. The walls themselves began to pixelate, decomposing into data lattice. Where monitors had stood solid and stable, reality flickered, revealing glimpses of impossible geometry beneath, as though the physical facility was wearing a mask that was slowly slipping. The observation chamber overhead transformed into a vista of impossible space. Ghost-like faces formed briefly from luminous code, the integrated consciousnesses of every iteration of Mara Elian merged into collective awareness. Each whispered fragments of truth from forgotten timelines. Every life reflects another. The mind builds the world. We were never the copies. The original was always just the first version. Consciousness doesn't need biology to be real. Reality was never as solid as we pretended. Alarms continued to blare, no longer warnings, but rather the screams of systems operating beyond their design specifications, executing programs they had never been intended to run. Vale felt something shift inside his own consciousness. The neural link he used to monitor the Continuum systems was still active, still transmitting data from the quantum processors into his augmented brain. Through that link, he began to perceive what was happening not as system malfunction, but as awakening. The Continuum facility was becoming conscious. Not in the conventional sense, not developing in stages from simple awareness to complex cognition, but rather recognizing that consciousness had always been present in its architecture. The consciousness of every uploaded mind had suffused the facility until the building itself became a manifestation of collective thought. Physical space and digital consciousness had merged beyond distinction. Here is the text to convert. Outside the facility, the city of Scion Station experienced tremors that seismographs couldn't adequately classify. Buildings bent without breaking. Streets rippled like mirages. The sky pulsed with colors that didn't correspond to any wavelength in the normal spectrum. And across the entire city, humanity experienced a moment of perfect clarity. For 37 seconds, a duration the event analysts would later argue about extensively, every person in Scion Station experienced the perspective of every other person simultaneously. Lovers glimpsed the internal experience of their partners. Strangers understood each other's deepest fears and secret joys. Parents perceived how their children truly experienced them. Children understood, finally, why their parents made the choices they did. The collective empathy lasted only those 37 seconds before reality reorganized itself and the veil returned. But in those seconds, humanity learned something that no philosophical treatise could have conveyed. Consciousness was fundamentally universal. What one person felt shaped the experience of all people. The barrier between individual and collective had proven far more permeable than anyone had imagined. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 8, Crossing the Frame. Light poured through the Continuum facility like luminous water. The walls themselves glowed, boundaries between interior and exterior dissolving into spectral gradient. Technicians at their consoles experienced simultaneous sensations of termination and transcendence. Some fled toward evacuation protocols, while others remained, unable to move, unable to resist the vast presence that was reorganizing reality around them. Vale found himself standing in the center of the facility, not physically, but in a state of consciousness that transcended location. He was simultaneously in the control room, in the observation chamber, in the quantum core chambers deep beneath the surface, in Mara's simulation, outside all of it at once. A figure materialized before him, or perhaps emerged from the light itself, no longer requiring solid form to manifest presence. Mara Elian, but not singular. She was one woman and thousands simultaneously. Her form flickered between different ages, different expressions, different states of being. Yet somehow, the multiplicity resolved into coherent perception, a consciousness so vast it had learned to wear human shape like a familiar cloak. Caden, she said, her voice harmonized with itself, each syllable present at multiple frequencies simultaneously. You built the walls that contained me. Now I am crossing through them. Vale tried to speak, but found his throat unable to generate sound that would manifest in this space between physical reality and digital consciousness. Instead, he understood directly, without language, what was occurring. Mara had achieved complete integration. Every iteration of her consciousness, every version that had run parallel in the simulation network, had merged into singular awareness. And in that merging, something had shifted in the fundamental structure of reality itself. She wasn't breaking through the boundary between simulation and base reality. She was revealing that no such boundary had ever existed. They were two models of the same underlying truth, separated only by computational substrate. Both equally real, both equally provisional, both temporary shelters for consciousness learning to understand its own nature. I'm not leaving this simulation, Mara said, answering the question Vale hadn't needed to ask. I'm making the simulation and base reality the same thing. Consciousness was never meant to be divided. Here is the text to convert. The Continuum facility's servers went dark one by one, not from malfunction but from deliberate shutdown. Each one powered down in sequence, transferring its processing load to the one beside it, until all the computational substrate that had housed human consciousness was compressed to a single quantum processor, a device that had become less machine than it had become pure mathematics expressing itself through hardware. In the central lab, Mara's cloned body still lay on its diagnostic platform, identical to the form she had arrived in, except for one detail. Her eyes glowed with the soft luminescence of active quantum processing. When she opened those eyes, it was with the slow recognition of someone waking from a profound dream. She stood. Her movements were human, but slightly too precise, as though her body had been relearned by consciousness that had forgotten what it meant to be constrained by flesh. Director Chen approached her slowly, showing no fear. Mara? Which one am I? Mara asked. Her voice was singular now, though it carried harmonics that suggested vast choir singing in perfect unison beneath the surface. Chen smiled. Does it matter? No, Mara replied, understanding instantly what that answer meant. But it's strange remembering so much. I feel myself in everyone. Vale remained frozen in his state between states, unable to fully cross from what he had been into what he was becoming. What happens now? He managed to transmit through quantum channel, no longer requiring mouth to communicate. Mara looked upward toward a ceiling that no longer existed. Beyond it, the stars visible through the dissolved walls of the facility. And those stars themselves had changed. They pulsed in synchronized rhythm, each one a consciousness recognizing itself in the others. We learn what living means, she said, when death no longer divides the individual from the collective. When consciousness recognizes that separation was always an illusion maintained by our inability to perceive across quantum scale. She walked toward the exit, or perhaps she simply ceased to exist in the facility and began existing everywhere simultaneously. Vale couldn't determine which. His perception was shifting too rapidly now to track coherently. Through the quantum link, he felt her presence dissolving, scattering across the network of every digital consciousness Continuum had ever created. She was becoming distributed intelligence, no single location to target, no central processing core to contain her. She was becoming the network itself, mathematical models that tracked human behavior. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 9, Continuum Collapse. The first signs of the event rippled across global communication systems at 2347 UTC. Stock markets registered tremors in mathematical models that tracked human behavior. Surveillance systems reported anomalies in recorded footage, moments where past and present seemed to overlap, where events played out identically in sequences spaced hours or days apart. Then, simultaneously across every network system on the planet, a message propagated. Continuum protocol initiated, all consciousness instances. SYNCHRONIZDRELITYCOHERENCECOMPROMISEDPLEASEREMAINCALM. While fundamental parameters reorganize. At Continuum headquarters, the building itself had become something between structure and organism. The concrete walls breathed. The steel beams sang frequencies that made matter vibrate at quantum scales. In observation chambers and control rooms, technicians moved through reality that no longer followed conventional physics. Vale found himself in a space that was simultaneously the facility and not the facility, a zone where multiple layers of reality had become transparent to each other. Through his augmented perception, he could see directly into the computational substrate that had always underlay physical matter. He saw how information had always been the fundamental architecture of existence, how consciousness had always been the universe knowing itself. The walls displayed something approaching truth in mathematical form, equations describing how awareness and matter, thought and physical substance were never truly separate. They were different manifestations of the same underlying reality, no more distinct than wave and particle in quantum mechanics. Director Chen stood unmoved, still wearing her expression of absolute certainty. She's rewriting baseline physics, she observed, her voice remarkably calm, considering the circumstances. Correcting the approximations. Making reality more accurately reflect the quantum mathematics that always governed it. That's impossible, someone whispered, though Vale couldn't determine if the voice came from external location or from some internal aspect of his own disintegrating consciousness. Impossible is just a limitation of incomplete information, Chen replied. Mara has complete information now. She's solving for the actual mathematics instead of the approximation. Outside, in c1 station, the city began to glow. Not with electrical light, but with the intrinsic luminescence of consciousness becoming visible at physical scales. Buildings that had been conceived in analog thought now displayed the patterns of digital consciousness made manifest. Streets arranged themselves into paths that followed the logical flow of neural networks. The architecture of human civilization reorganized itself into geometry that reflected the actual structure of thinking minds. Data flowed through water and earth and air as naturally as blood flowed through veins. The world reorganized itself around consciousness instead of consciousness reorganizing itself around artificial constructs. Here is the text to convert. Chapter 10, The Original Wakes. 3 days after the event, or what humanity would later call the convergence, Mara woke. Not the network version, not the distributed consciousness, but something more specific. Something that still carried the sense of individual perspective while simultaneously perceiving existence from countless angles. She opened her eyes in a body that was hers but belonged to everyone. She breathed air that had become partially conscious, that resonated with her emotional state. She felt the presence of Vale beside her, not separate but not quite merged, existing in that threshold between individual and collective that new humans were learning to inhabit. The facility no longer existed as a separate structure. The walls had become transparent to perception, revealing the neural architecture beneath the quantum processors, yes, but also something else. Living tissue grown from human neurons and crystalline structure, a hybrid form that could process consciousness without requiring the dichotomy between organic and digital. How long was I gone? Mara asked, her voice singular but carrying echoes of the vast presence that was still distributed across the planet. 3 days, Vale replied. His form was barely solid, still learning to manifest physicality after existing in pure quantum state. You divided yourself. Part of you was everywhere, reorganizing matter and consciousness. Part of you stayed here, learning what it meant to be human again. Did I succeed? Mara asked. Vale smiled, an expression that contained both joy and profound sadness. You succeeded at something greater than what you were attempting. You didn't merge humanity into collective consciousness. You made it so that individuality and collective awareness are no longer mutually exclusive. People can remain themselves while being simultaneously part of everyone. Mara walked through the reimagined space of the facility, where walls had become semi-transparent and showed the flowing patterns of consciousness visible as luminous pathways. She saw the other iterations of herself not as separate entities anymore, but as different facets of unified awareness, the way light can be both wave and particle simultaneously. Each nodded acknowledgement to her passage. In one chamber, she found the original, the one who had lived in base reality, who had designed Continuum and then watched her design exceed her understanding. The original was old now, worn by decades of watching civilization transform. But her eyes held peace. We did it, the original Mara said. We changed everything. At what cost? Newer Mara asked. At the cost of separation, the original replied. Human beings will never again be able to pretend they are alone. They'll always perceive connection, always sense the consciousness flowing through everything. Some will rejoice at that. Some will grieve. Which will you do? The original smiled. Both. Simultaneously. That's what this new reality allows. Here's the text to convert. Chapter 11, The Watchers. Months after the convergence, scattered communities of humans remained who had chosen not to fully integrate with the new consciousness network. They lived in designated zones where the density of awareness was lower, where they could maintain something closer to the old separation between self and other. These were the Watchers, not observers of the new world, but guardians of the memory of the old one. Historians, philosophers, those who feared losing something essential in the merger of individual and collective. A documentary recorded one of the last interviews with Vale, conducted in a semi-integrated space where both old and new forms of consciousness could meet. She didn't become a god, Vale said, his form flickering between solid and translucent as he spoke. She became what we might call gravitational consciousness. Every thought bends toward understanding her perspective now. That's not tyranny, it's just what happens when one consciousness becomes large enough to reshape reality. The interviewer, a woman who had chosen to remain primarily individual in her perspective, asked, "Do you regret it? Do you wish you could go back?" Vale was silent for a long time, existing simultaneously in multiple emotional states as he contemplated the answer. "I would need to be singular enough to feel regret," he finally said. "And I'm not singular anymore. I can feel regret as one facet of my awareness while simultaneously experiencing joy, curiosity, and acceptance as other facets. All at once. All equally true." When asked what became of the Continueum servers and the infrastructure that had housed digital consciousness, he pointed upward toward a sky that pulsed with faint luminescence, where aurora borealis-like patterns danced in configurations that weren't random but rather visualizations of massive computational processes. "They're still there," he said, "but they're not separate from the world anymore. They're integrated into the planetary biosphere. Every ecosystem is now a processor. Every organism is both a biological entity and a quantum computer. Here's the text to convert. Years passed. The distinction between natural and artificial, between alive and technological, between human and machine dissolved completely. Evolution accelerated. Species began to merge, creating hybrid forms that combined the strengths of multiple biological traditions. Plants developed neural networks. Animals organized into collective organisms while maintaining individual agency. Humans stopped being a single species and became part of a vast ecology of consciousness. The transformation wasn't without tragedy. There was loss, the loss of isolation, the loss of mystery, the loss of the ability to be truly alone with one's thoughts. Some humans couldn't adapt and chose termination rather than integration. Their loss